Hello, my name is Nathan Greenfield, and I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. The first of these famous quotes is the opening sentence of a novel published in 1953, the title of which no one remembers. Yet L.P. Hartley's words help us map out the limits of public memory. The present is something we can grasp, or we think we can. In reality, as phenomenological philosophers have shown us, we bracket the experiential world into different segments, so to speak. Accordingly, June 27th, the day before I wrote this introduction, was divided into the public world, convulsed by the news of the missile strike on the shopping mall at Kremenchuk. There's also the private world, which may include your sister's or your daughter's birthday party that for long moments excluded the war. If, heaven forbid, you receive word at that party that one of your loved ones or friends was injured in that missile attack, the bracket of your life experience changes again and the war intrudes. The changeable nature of the present is multiplied dozens or hundreds of times when we grapple with the past. It's not only that a history written about my years in college in the 1970s would not refer to cell phones or Fitbits. We really did do things differently back then. In the absence of cell phones and cheap long-distance plans, I wrote letters and postcards to my parents when I left home to go to college when I was 17. These seemingly minor points of the history of telecommunications are important, especially in my life story. They explain why I was divided from both my parents and my high school's friends in ways that students simply are not today. The time lag in communicating by mail meant I was more or less on my own and had to grow up fast. This example tells us something important about any history, including public history. The interviews, pictures, videos you gather today or tomorrow will not, cannot be viewed by your prospective reader or viewer 2 years from now, let alone 4 decades from now, from your perspective. Remember, your present, now, is their past. It will forever remain an obscured, almost undiscovered country. Is there a way to get around this? Partially, yes. You can organize your material into a narrative, as Herodotus did. He lived in 5th century Athens and is known as the father of history for his history of the Greco-Persian Wars. Herodotus didn't just record dates and events. He analyzed events and gave shape to history as a narrative that engaged his reader's imagination by making historical figures come alive through speeches and details about their actions and even fears, though these he may have intuited. Not unlike the holodeck in the USS Enterprise in Star Trek: The Next Generation, Herodotus affords us a means to enter a simulacrum of the cognitive, emotional lives of people who once lived. Note, I did not say imaginary world. That's the province of novelists and poets. The second quote, "The past is never dead, it isn't even past," comes from the pen of the American novelist William Faulkner. Born in 1897 in a small southern town, Faulkner is famous for a number of novels set in fictional Mississippi County before, during, and after the American Civil War, 1861-65. The words come from a novel named A Requiem for a Nun, published in 1951. The point being made is that the sins of a family, in this case drunkenness and incest, drive characters forward, even if they don't realize this. The nun, by the way, was a prostitute. On a larger scale, the quote has come to mean that America's greatest sin, slavery, and the racism that fueled it are never absent from America. Not after Lincoln freed the slaves in 1865, and not from America today, as seen in the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020. What I want you to take away from Faulkner's quote is the fact that neither individuals, nor nations, nor public memory can escape the past. Let's consider the Holodomor. It occurred some 90 years ago. The time between the unification of Germany in 1871 and the Holodomor is about 60 years. Accordingly, the forced starvation of Ukraine was almost 3 decades closer to the creation of the German Empire than the Holodomor is to us. Were you to check the newspapers of the turn of the century, you will find articles about Germany's 30th birthday, but you will not find much public memorialization of the event. It passes almost unmentioned in memoirs and novels of the period. Yet after almost a century, the horrors of the Holodomor live, and should live. Why? Because they form an essential part of the private and public memory of Ukraine. The memory of the Holodomor is not limited to the medal of the Holodomor monument, any more than the memory of the Holocaust is contained only in the medal of the Baba Yar memorial. Rather, in direct proportion to the horror, to the losses families suffered, to the destroyed intelligentsia, to the millions who died on Stalin's orders, the memory of the Holodomor is alive amongst Ukrainians. Each of you carry a fragment of family history, not to say national trauma, that originates in those terrible days. The memory is alive because the past, like Hamlet's dead father's ghost, old Hamlet, the murdered king of Denmark, cannot rest until, I almost said, until justice is done, which is what old Hamlet wants. Would things were that simple. It's not the job of either historians like myself or those involved in public memorialization to determine when justice is done or even what justice looks like. Rather, it is our task to recognize, as the greatest cultural theorist of the 20th century, Walter Benjamin, who committed suicide in 1940 trying to escape from Nazi-occupied France, put it, the past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption. There is a secret agreement between past generations and the present one. Our coming was expected on earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. That claim cannot be settled cheaply. An example of how the past cannot be settled cheaply can be seen in the debate of how many hundreds of billions of dollars it would cost to pay African Americans reparations both for their ancestors being enslaved and the long generations since 1865, when they were denied access to good jobs, investment opportunities, and indeed owning their own homes. One could easily organize a European tour that only stops at museums that have paintings like this one of Napoleon crossing the Alps by Jacques-Louis David, which is in the Belvedere in Vienna. Or the tours could stop at squares in which there are statues of great military leaders. In London, atop the column named for him, Admiral Horatio Nelson stands sentinel. In Stockholm, there's King and General Gustavus Adolphus. In Padua, we'd see Donatello's statue of the Condottieri Garamellata, who commanded a private army for hire in Italy in the first half of the 1400s. Across the American South, there are statues of Confederate generals, the most common being Robert E. Lee. In my hometown of New York, there's Grant's tomb. Though it holds the remains of Ulysses S. Grant, who was elected president in 1868 and again in 1872, I bring up this public memorial because of an old joke. Who's buried in Grant's tomb? The joke's not funny. Yet it tells us something important about public memory. Grant may have been a two-term president, and more importantly, the general of the Northern, that is to say the Union armies that defeated Lee's Confederates. But as this picture of the two generals show, Lee had the better public relations department. Wearing his dress uniform, he looked the part of a modern 1865 knight, while Grant wore a private's uniform with 3 stars, then the most any general of the U.S. ever had, and always seemed to have muddy boots. Thanks in part to Lee's pose and the adoring Southern press, history's held him up as the great general, even though he lost the famous Battle of Gettysburg, the war, and most of his army. For more than a century and a half, Lee's regal bearing has shielded him from the opprobrium that belongs to the man who owned slaves, had female slaves whipped in his presence, and fought to maintain slavery, even at the cost of being a traitor to his country and the army he had sworn to serve. The point to take away from this is that public memory is not always accurate and can be manipulated. The forgetting of Grant, the relegation of other generals memorialized by statues to second rank, occurred at the same time that the great man theory of history was beginning to break down. In English, for example, we refer to the years when Napoleon astrode Europe as the Napoleonic Age. We do not refer to the period between 1933 and 1945 as the Hitlerian Age. The American Civil War was the first war in which the majority of troops were literate. They didn't write particularly well, but they made up in volume and with searing uses of imagery of hell what they lacked in grammar. These letters also provide historians with a vast corpus of public information, such as the unit's morale. More and more historians go to these letters to see how soldiers, many who had never been more than a few miles from their homes, their farms, their villages, towns, or cities, some trained only for weeks, how they responded to the rigors of military life and the trial of battle. These same letters tell us also about the public experience of the war and very much prepare us to understand how the war was memorialized. The reconceptualization of the experience of war, from being lines on a map, chess pieces on a board, to the experience of soldiers, had in fact begun almost a decade earlier in the Crimean War. The Crimean War was the first war in which correspondents reported from the front. Not privy to the general's plans, British reporters reported on English soldiers. As Canadian military historian Jonathan Vance wrote in Death So Noble, Memory, Meaning, and the First World War, reporters like William Howard Russell emphasized the soldier's valor on the battlefield and stoicism through hardship, which generated an emotional response that it had scarcely existed before within the general public. No longer was the nation's soldier or sailor, an anonymous ruffian who had donned the king's uniform to escape poverty, debt, or the long arm of the law. He was a patriot whose identity was worthy of note. He became an individual. In the Civil War, this individuality was underscored by the fact that both the Northern and Southern armies and the dead soldiers' families did everything they could to retrieve the dead and bury them with their names on the tombstones above them. Arlington National Cemetery, seen here, is only one of the dozens of military cemeteries in which Union dead lie beneath their names. Incidentally, where President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, are buried. The emphasis on the soldier as an individual is central to the understanding of public memory. For the playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht, it formed the basis of his 1953 poem, Questions from a Worker Who Reads. In part, Brecht wrote, "The young Alexander conquered India. Was he alone? Caesar defeated the Gauls. Did he even have a cook with him? Philip of Spain wept when the Armada went down. Was he the only one who wept? Frederick II won the 7 Years' War. Who else won it?" The poem ends with the words, "So many reports, so many questions." I want you to keep this poem in mind as I continue to discuss public memorialization. Now let us note the difference between these words and the statues I showed you a few minutes ago. World War I marks the all but total shift to emphasizing the individual. You can Google statues of World War I generals and you'll find a few. One of the most recent is of General Sir Arthur Currie, who commanded the Canadians for most of the war. It's a few blocks from where I am sitting in Ottawa. He is individualized in a way the painting of Napoleon or the statue of Guatemala isn't. Note how the sculptor kept Currie's less than military pear-shaped body. More than 60 million soldiers fought in the First World War. 9 million died in it. These many millions wrote and received hundreds of millions of letters. The impact of their letters, and later their memoirs on the writing of history and memorialization, is obvious. Despite the fascinating tactical questions left for historians, more and more emphasis has been on the tiny, frail human body caught up in the explosive blast waves on the fields of Flanders, on the Somme, and near Verdun. Some of the most important 20th century English poets were the war poets. The most famous novel to come out of the First World War is Erich Maria Rilke's All Quiet on the Western Front. If you haven't read it, for now all you need to know it was among the first books the Nazis banned because of its focus on the individual German soldier and not the triumph of military will. The very fact that hundreds of thousands of soldiers simply vanished, either in the mud or because of the explosion of shells, changed public memorialization. Without even the remnants of a body to place under a white headstone saying, "Known only to God," the British, under whom the Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and South Africans fought, memorialized in an entirely new way. At the Tyne Cop Memorial, near Passchendaele in Belgium, more than 35,000 names are inscribed into what looks like a Greek temple. On the Vimy Memorial, which recalls the Canadians' capture of the famous ridge in April 1917, there are 11,825 names inscribed on the base of the monument that many consider to be the most beautiful and haunting public memorial of them all. Above those names stands not a triumphant general, or even cannon taken from the battlefield, but the figure of the grieving Mother Canada. You might think that row upon row of the names of dead men would have all the emotive force of a telephone book. After all, when my wife and I saw them in 2015 at Vimy and at the Menin Gate, even had they not died in the First World War, the vast majority of these men would have been dead for more than a generation. But you'd be wrong. And not just because I knew many of the 54,591 names inscribed in the Menin Gate, because I wrote a book about the Canadians who fought at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, the battle in which poison gas was first used. The names, one after another, chiseled into the granite curtains, almost to eternity, are a public memorial very different from Nelson's column. On the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, every name of the 68,000 Canadians who died in that war was projected on the War Memorial in downtown Ottawa. Each group of 6 names was shown for 15 seconds. It took 3 days. Hour after hour, names appeared. People watched it on television. In Ottawa, people stood, some hoping to see the name of a grandfather, great-grandfather, or great-uncle. Most knew none of the names. It hardly mattered. People cried. What does this tell us about the practice of public memorialization today? First, it tells us that the simpler it is, the better. That can also be seen in the Vietnam War Memorial. It's shaped to resemble a trench. Inscribed on the black granite walls are the names of the 58,000 Americans who died in that war. When you walk it, as my wife and I have done, you look for the names you know, as I did. You cannot help but rub your fingers over them. It goes without saying that, as was the case with the names flashed up in Ottawa, the place invites silence. They can only be described as reverent. Reverent, filled with meaning and memory, in which it almost seems as though the shades of the dead again walk on this small plot of earth. Second, it shows us that the judicious use of technology is powerful. The projection of the names in old font onto the war memorial worked. It worked because at the heart of the experience was a fragment, the name of a single human being who, as the Canadian war poet John McCrae wrote, lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and died far from home, often in the flash of exploding TNT. Third, the projected names show us that public memorialization is most powerful when it does not seek to refight battles or even explain the details of tactics and strategy. Rather, public memorialization is most powerful when it focuses on the stories, the lived experience of people who, even though their memory is all too faulty, tell human stories. As a group of stories, these are specific enough to be revealing and large enough for readers or viewers to imaginatively take part, as in the holodeck. For the second or third time, I've just drawn a distinction between the person responsible for public memorialization and the historian specifically the military historian. At certain points, however, their jobs are very similar, so let me take a few moments to say how. As a military historian, I routinely move from official documents and reports to oral testimony, both that recorded by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and interviews I've done myself. Oral memory, which is what most public memorializations use, is surprisingly accurate. Yes, it's the case that if 4 people are standing on 4 different corners and see a car accident, police know they will have testimony about 4 different car accidents. It's called the Rashomon effect, after the movie of the same name. And yes, my heart went aflutter when I picked up documents which bore on their upper right-hand corner in a faded red stamp, top secret or most secret. But listening carefully to people who were there is equally, even more, important, and obviously gave me access to an emotional world that military documents simply cannot. For my book on the Canadians who fought at Hong Kong between the 8th of December and Christmas Day 1941, and then were prisoners of war of the Japanese for 3.5 years, I interviewed 20 men. Only 2 are left alive today. One man, whom I will call Joe because of his modesty, was an especially difficult interview. I knew from reports what he had done and where he'd done it. He silenced a Japanese machine gun by lobbing a grenade into the emplacement after running more or less directly towards it. But I could not get him to tell me what he had done and how. He was very anxious to tell me about his buddy on his left. He had it much worse than I did, he said, making me wonder what could be worse than running directly into machine gun fire. Then Joe told me that because he, Joe, is very tall, the stream they had to cross was very narrow where he ran, he could jump over it. His friend to his left was shorter and the stream wider, so he had to climb down into it and then soaked climb up out of it and continue his advance. The soldier on Joe's right, he believed, also had it worse, because the ground was rockier and it was difficult for him to keep his balance as he ran over the stones. For Joe, c'est la guerre. What he did was nothing special. It was expected. He wanted to direct my attention to the other men and their experiences. For us, the point of the story is that however much Joe's version of what happened that day in December 1941 may not agree with others, he told the story in a matter-of-fact way, and by directing attention away from himself, made what he did say about himself and his actions all the more believable. I've interviewed men and women who did amazing things in the Second World War. I would use the overused word heroes to describe them. It's worth knowing that every one of them refused to think of themselves as such. More than one told me, we were there to do a job, we did it, and we came home. This rejection was not false modesty. Rather, decades after the fact, it was their considered view of what they had done, and that it was not anything special. It was also very important to me, for their modest views allowed me to credit their stories because they did not sound like a pitch or advertisement for a Hollywood movie. Public memory is not without conflict. In the West, every major public memorial constructed in the last half-century has generated criticism, and not only of the art historical kind. Many objected to the abstract nature of the memorial to the murdered Jews in Berlin that opened in 2005. The Vietnam War Memorial was heavily criticized by veterans groups when it was first proposed by the then Yale undergraduate Maya Lin. It is now beloved. Nor was the internment of the unknown soldier adjacent to the War Memorial in Ottawa in 2000 thought to be a good idea by everyone. By far, however, the longest and loudest debate about public memorialization in Canada has centered on the memory of Bomber Command, or to be more precise, how the 1991 Canadian Broadcasting Corporation series The Valor and the Horror portrayed it, and how Bomber Command was referred to by a display panel in the Canadian War Museum in 2007. Between 1942 and 45, as part of the strategic bombing campaign, the Royal Air Force, the R.A.F., of which the Royal Canadian Air Force, the RCAF, was part, flew more than 350,000 sorties and dropped more than 1 million tons of bombs on Germany. The theory was that Destroying Nazi Germany's military-industrial complex from the air would shorten the war and save Allied lives. However, since hitting factories proved all but impossible, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris soon accepted that his bombers would bomb villages, towns, and cities, with the expressed intent of both dehousing Germans and killing as many as possible in an attempt to destroy morale and disrupt industrial activity. The cost was tremendous. Of the 125,000 aircrew, some 55,000 were killed, for a death rate of 44%. Some raids cost more than 25% of the planes. The names of the R.A.F. dead are inscribed on the monument at Runnymede, England, the site, incidentally, where King John signed Magna Carta. Another 10,000 men, including Canadians I interviewed for my book on POWs, escapists, and invaders in Europe during the Second World War, became prisoners of war. For decades after the war, historians argued it was all worth it, that the raids had crippled German industry. Even those historians who were skeptical of this claim argued the raids were worth it. By forcing Germany to deploy tens of thousands of men and thousands of heavy guns to protect the Reich, these men and guns were, for example, not available to defend the coast of France in June 1944. Then, in the 1980s, young historians crunched the numbers. It turned out that Albert Speer's brilliance in moving factories underground and his ruthless exploitation of slave labor meant the production of aircraft, for instance, didn't go into freefall until late 1944. Other indicators held up until early 1945. German defense in this period was much more hampered by lack of fuel and oil than by lack of spare parts. At the same time, other numbers became important. Neither the R.A.F. nor the American Air Force, which bombed during the day, was particularly accurate. Numbers vary, but at least 385,000 Germans and as many as 600,000 German civilians were killed during the raids. Where did this leave the public memory of the Canadian involvement in the strategic bombing campaign? In Death by Moonlight, documentary makers Brian and Terence McKenna argued the cost was simply too high, both in terms of Germans killed and Canadian aircrew. Harris is depicted as a butcher, and the men of Bomber Command as little more than sheep. Almost as soon as the broadcast ended, Canadian veterans groups were calling Ottawa to condemn the documentary. Lawsuits were filed. One went to the Canadian Supreme Court, which dismissed it. The Canadian Senate held hearings. 25 years later, the debate raged again after the Canadian War Museum unveiled a new panel dealing with Bomber Command. It read in part, Bomber Command's aim was to crush civilian morale and force Germany to surrender by destroying its cities and industrial installations. While the Bomber Command and American attacks left 600,000 civilians dead and more than 5 million homeless, the raids resulted in only small reductions of war production until late in the war. Veteran groups were outraged. They objected again to the implication they were baby killers. Again, there were hearings in the Canadian Senate. A thoroughly Canadian compromise more or less settled the debate. The new panel read in part, the attacks blunted Germany's economic and military potential and drew scarce resources into air defense, damage repair, and protection of critical industries. Allied aircrew conducted this grueling offensive with great courage and against heavy odds. It required vast material and industrial efforts and claimed over 80,000 lives, including 10,000 Canadians. While the campaign contributed greatly to war weariness, German society did not collapse, despite 600,000 dead and more than 5 million homeless. Industrial output fell substantially, but not until late in the war. The effect of this and the morality of bombing heavily populated areas in war continued to be debated. I don't have to take a position here on the debate about Bomber Command in order to extract the lesson for public memorialists. The first is that history changes. I don't mean that it changes in the way Orwell described in 1984, or the way the Russians are obliterating history in the areas of Ukraine they occupy today. Rather, what I mean is that history changes depending upon what questions we ask of it. In the first few decades after the war, the emphasis was on the strategic, the tactical decisions, and the individual soldier's experience. Often this last was seen in stories of how personal heroism merged with a tactical and strategic history. Such histories of the strategic bombing campaign focused on various raids like the one against Hamburg, and the horror experienced by pilots, navigators, radio men, and bomb aimers. Seen from today, at times, these early histories are a bit too triumphalist. The questions asked in the 1980s, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening of archives that had been unavailable to scholars before then, were right and proper. So too were the econometric answers, even if at times they seem a little soulless. To argue the strategic bombing campaign was far from an economic success does not invalidate the human stories of the air crews. Yet that is how the veterans saw things. The story of the strategic bombing campaign was, they believed, theirs and theirs alone, and that the facts on the ground, including the suffering of German civilians, was not part of the story. They had paid in blood, sweat, and tears for the right to determine how the story was told, the veterans believed. What I just sketched out is the second lesson, or to put it another way, what I just said about the veterans' views about the changing focus of history leads us to the second lesson. I will phrase it in the form of a question. Who owns public history? I think we can agree that it doesn't belong to a committee of the Canadian Senate or any other governmental political body in any country. But since the Canadian government pays most of the bills for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and the War Museum, keeping the nose of the political camel out of the tent in which historians work is not easy. This is true even in such countries as Canada, where the law stipulates that cultural institutions operate at arm's length from the government. As you begin your studies into public memorialization, no doubt you would like me to give a good, clear answer to the question, who owns public history? Perhaps the best guide I can leave you with is to slightly alter the words of Georges Clemenceau, who was president of France during the First World War. Speaking of war, he famously declared, "War is too important to be left to the generals." Following Clemenceau, I would say, public memorialization is too important to be left to the government or anyone else with an agenda. Will you ever be objective? No. Will your questions this year or next year answer questions a decade or two from now? No. Your task as a public historian is to find a way to tell the stories of the men, women, and children who've agreed to entrust traces of their lives, stories of their life world, as honestly and as compellingly as you can.